In 2020, I founded Golden Threads, it's my banner over there, which is a project to explore and document shared histories across the Muslim world and beyond. I'm also dedicated to addressing the issues of inequality and discrimination and challenging racism and Islamophobia. Very honoured, and it's just such a pleasure to have you here, George, with us today. I have a bit of a bio about you just to set the scene and talk a little bit about your book. So George, a poet, needs little introduction, but as you know, he's a world-renowned spoken word artist, poet, rapper, award-winning podcast host and author, and he has recently released his much-anticipated autobiography, Track Record. This book is a combination of an insight into George's life, interspersed with commentary on history, the war against Blackness, and the music industry. George's continued presence and involvement for the betterment of the community is what, for me, is his track record, and with that comes ever respect and trust. So when I saw your book come out, George, this was around April, I saw it being advertised a bit before, and I felt so passionately that we needed to have a launch event here, and right here in this borough, because of how much you mean to us here. And I'm so happy that we are able to have this conversation now and explore the book in more detail. So my first question is about why did you decide to write Track Record now? It's an autobiography, you're still really young. And why now, and what did you want it to achieve?
First of all, thank you guys for giving me your time, and special thanks to Nadia, because it was exactly as she said. The book was already slated to come out, and we met at a pro-Palestine rally actually, and just started talking, and Nadia just insisted that there has to be something Brent focused. So it's an honor that you guys actually showed up. So my career has always been a project in proving that we can use music, we can use art, creativity and culture to improve our society. Not just maybe if people enjoy the poetry, their lives will become better. No, how can I design this poetry, design my work in a way that can educate, can help us to heal, and help us to take stock. So that sounds very, what's the word? It's not that I expected to save the world. It's just that I always found that music was like a safe space where we could just be free for a second. But it really bothered me that when the music finishes, we're back to quite a harsh reality in a lot of what we see around us anyway. So I didn't want that to be my career. I didn't want it to be that I just give my listeners little 5-minute escapes, and then you got to go back to a reality that seems to be slipping out of your control, which I often feel like. I wanted it to be that when you engage with my work, you and me, are going on a journey of understanding, of strengthening our responses to the world around us, and of continuing to build our resilience, because it feels like there's always something coming. So I wanted that, and I've been trying different ways of doing that since I was like 15 years old. And I felt that at this stage, I want to explain as much as I can about what I've learned and what I hope the generation after me take on, and what I hope to inherit and carry on from the generations before me.
And I wanted to ask you about roots, because roots are so important to every single one of us, but being children of the diaspora, you can often feel like you're rootless. And I wanted to ask you, how important was growing up in St. Raph's? It's so central to your identity, you talk about it in the book, but also I wanted to ask the other experiences that you had outside of the estate, the school you went to and then Cambridge University, how have those also impacted you?
I feel like we're lucky in this borough. We probably take it for granted living here, but it's a very diverse borough. You can see it when you look around the room. Growing up in St. Raf's, we had a mix of people. There was a big Jamaican community, Somali community, Pakistani, a couple Ghanaian, Congolese families, and that's all we knew. I went to school in Stonebridge. My primary school was Brentfield. I also went to Furness and just local Brent schools, and what everywhere that I turned in my childhood, there were different languages. There was a mix, and that was beautiful. I didn't realize how much I appreciated it until I went to my secondary school. So I went to a secondary school way out of the area. It was in Barnet. It's a grammar school as well. So culturally, it was kind of different. It was more, I don't know, let's say more upper class. And it was, the diversity was different. The groups of people that I found were different. And I just, like, there were no black people. So that threw me off. But it helped me learn more and more about the dynamics, the racial dynamics, the power dynamics of this country. It was a good school as well, so I even like in that, I started to associate moving forward in my education with moving away from my community, which I found unacceptable. I always felt like you shouldn't have to leave. I mean, I had to, but you shouldn't have to leave to be able to have an experience that, you know, an educational experience that is going to increase your life chances. So I took that very personally. And I always felt that those of us who have people's attention, those of us who go through this education system, as long as we don't forget our roots, we should be able to prevent more young people from having to make that decision. We should be able to reach back and say, here is how you can move to spaces of more opportunity. Here's how you can bring opportunity to your area, to your people. And, you know, hopefully make it easier for people that are going to walk that walk. So I always wanted to do that. And going back to the cultural thing, I always knew that doing it through art, creativity, culture is like a secret weapon. Because we don't lack that. We have no shortage of creativity and culture. And I don't like it being implied that that is not intellectual or that's not educational. I always felt like what we do, especially when I started rapping, what we do takes a lot of brain power. You know, a lot of the creativity that we are forced to tap into just to live our lives out here. It's not minor, it's not Mickey Mouse. You know, so I really wanted to hold on to those roots everywhere I went.
Yeah, I think that's really important. We were having that talk outside as well before we came in. In the book you say, the theme of community is a key part of this book. And my definition of it has been influenced by these experiences. So all these experiences that you've just spoken about and more. So you are really grounded in community. You can see that. You know, I've seen you at so many events. And you say that has kept you in tune and linked with people on the ground still, and kept you humbled. You're not removed from the people you talk about. What is your understanding of community, and what does it mean to you?
I heard someone say yesterday, Nadia, actually, that when we claim that we're part of a community, it's not that a set of characteristics automatically springs out from within us. We're making a decision. You know, if I say that I'm from Brent, if I say that I'm an African, I'm a Pan-African, I'm a Ugandan, I am deciding, first of all, to identify along those lines with that experience. Secondly, through my actions, I have to demonstrate what that means. No one's going to hand me a certificate and say, you are a Brent resident, you know, you are a rapper, no, it's through my conduct and it's through the people that I'm connected with, the people that I serve, the people that I keep in consideration through my work and my life. That is how prove what I think what community I think I'm part of. So I remember, I might be preempting some of your questions, but at some point in the book I talk about how I signed a record deal and I was kind of on my way to like mainstream success, and it was cool, but it wasn't really what I wanted, so I ended up pivoting away from the deal. And I remember the people that signed me, they were really concerned that I was going to leave this record label and go to another record label down the road. But I remember explaining to them that the reason I'm leaving you guys is because I need to focus on the community. The more time I spend out here playing a game that forces me to chase fame, which was never my priority, the more time I spend doing that, the further distance I am. I remember what I said about going to school and realizing that to move forward in my education, I am being removed from my community. I experienced that at 11 years old. I didn't want that to become the pattern of my life. So now that I'm becoming a national name or a brand, I'm no longer able to be just around. I'm no longer connected to the spaces I used to be. My parents used to take me to this library, they're right here. Make some noise for my parents, man. They used to take me to this library when I was a baby, and it's a shame for like the busyness of life or whatever, the progression of my career to make me removed from these spaces. That's something I couldn't accept. So I left the industry, and I'll leave any space that requires me to forget where I came from.
And they say charity begins at home. So I feel the same, that this is the community that has, brought me up, nurtured me, and there are issues, and I'm committed to also giving back. And I think it's very easy to walk away. It's a hard work to stay. So before we go on, I was wondering if you could do a reading from the book.
Of course.
So we've got a page here for you.
So this is from the second to last chapter of the book. This chapter's called The Bigger Picture. It's me wrapping up a lot of what I've learned. By telling my story, I've laid out my predicament. I'm a black entertainer on the front line of the war on blackness. But it's not always clear who I'm fighting for. Is it the children of Africa or their abusers? Through my poetry, I've shone a light on many aspects of black life, which I do in solidarity with Afro-descended people everywhere. But this poetry has been funded and distributed by a media industry that platforms endless strategies of anti-blackness. Yes, my listeners say I've inspired them over the years, but I've only ever done so without critiquing capitalism, i.e., dealing with the symptoms, not the sickness. Does this mean I accept the inequality that the system creates? I've come to the disappointing realization that I'm useful to Western media for all the wrong reasons. As a good immigrant who went to school, stayed out of trouble, and rose to fame with non-threatening poems that criticized my own community for the problems it faced, I presented a narrative that aligned with ruling class interests. I made the system look good. All those people claiming that racism and poverty were holding them back just needed to be more like me. To work hard and expect no favors, as if poverty doesn't force you to do that anyway. Okay, I'm being a bit unfair to myself. My poetry has always dealt with the injustices imposed on my people, and to be fair, in the early days, I was writing to oppose the weird anti-black themes of mainstream rap. But my overall thing was, let's work within the system to change what we can. This message came from a deep commitment to self-reliance, which, now that I think about it, came from insecurities about my neighborhood and our relationship with the government. These insecurities bled into my art, driving me to push back against mainstream rap's weirdness. However, without a radical analysis of society, I can only push back by promoting self-help to my corner of the ghettoized black diaspora, like a real liberal cliche. And in my efforts to do so, I wrote poems that talk to my listeners on a personal level, saying, close your eyes and feel my pain, instead of statistics show. But as a child of the 1990s, immersed in Western mainstream media, I couldn't help painting an individualistic, pro-capitalist picture of social change, repeating mistakes made by Booker T. Washington 100 years prior. It's not that my poetry said, stop complaining, get money. It's more that I had no concept of collective struggle or real political education. Looking back, it feels like I spent as much time denouncing the effects of poverty as I did breaking down the causes. That's not a good ratio. I guess I'm describing the process of becoming a black conservative. It's a trap you fall into once you accept the brazenness of the West and become attached to whatever perks it has to offer. To conserve means to keep something as it is, and for black people, this is a complex instinct. We may want to conserve our family values or our cultural distinctions from overbearing trends, Western trends. And the way we do this sometimes appears to be through hard-won access to institutions that our ancestors fought for us to enter. Yet, as centuries of evidence suggest, none of this promises the change we need. In my case, formal education hid the racist world order from me, while also giving me a route out of the low-income, marginalized status of my community. It never occurred to me that this status was manufactured, like the educational prestige I was betting my future on. So by extension, it never occurred to me that the majority of my peers would never access the same opportunities as me. Therefore, it also never occurred to me that the global economy was designed to work this way. This oversight prevents a lot of well-off black people from engaging with the reality faced by most people of African descent. The time many black conservatives spend working in white spaces takes them away from black life, filling their heads with perspectives that affirm the status quo and distorting their view of black issues. To the untrained eye, I didn't look like this kind of conservative, but by focusing on the symptoms of poverty and not the causes, while pursuing an education outside of my community that didn't deal with our history, I was becoming insensitive to those who had a much harder life than me. This conservative strain in my thinking was reinforced when I became George the Poet, and as I now enjoyed a growing audience that liked what I had to say. It started with black students and rappers who saw me as a breath of fresh air, and extended to non-black audiences of all ages, which complicated things, although it's what I wanted. This hybrid audience gave me a career based on my ability to make them feel something, not to facilitate real change. That's not a criticism of my audience. I'm truly thankful for every listener, journalist, blogger, or DJ who has appreciated and shared my work. It means a lot to me that in an imperfect world, with our imperfect selves, we've connected meaningfully over something I put my best intentions into. The problem is, when my self-help ethos is turned into a message directed at a whole class of poor, racialized people in full view of everyone else, it can be used to suggest that the solution to inequality is more personal responsibility from marginalized people, not a change of system. This myth is promoted by the individualism at the heart of celebrity culture in general, but mainstream rap in particular. It shapes the values and dreams of our children, while completely downplaying the scale of organized violence black people have faced all along. Thank you.
So, obviously, we are becoming Brent is part of the anniversary moments of the Empire exhibition that was here in Wembley in 1924. And so that leads me to ask you, can we talk about what the British Empire conjures up for you? You famously rejected the MBE, which is massive. And there's other heroes like Benjamin Zephaniah did the same, but it's few and far between. Can you talk us through your thoughts that you went through and the conviction that you had to reject it?
I turned down the MBE. First, I was so for anyone who doesn't know, MBE is an honour from at the time it was the Queen, and it is to say thank you / well done for what you contributed to society. Now, I was speaking with Nadia and her father earlier today. Yes, Aaron. What's going on, bro? I used to this guy in like 15 years. Good to see you. Sorry. MBE, it means member of the British Empire. I was speaking with Nadia and her father earlier. Nadia's father came to the country many years ago, and he was speaking to us about his passion for contributing to British society because he was grateful for the opportunity to be here, and he wanted to be a citizen that gave himself to the country. I was on the same thing, I really appreciate the life and the opportunities that I've enjoyed in Britain. But at the same time, when this honour came my way and I saw member of the British Empire on the letter that they sent, I was like, what do you mean, member of the British Empire? First of all, we haven't had a conversation about what the British Empire was. And the more I got into that, the more I was like, the British Empire was a system of extraction around the world. Started with Ireland and just continued to the islands of the Caribbean, to Asia, eventually to Africa. And everywhere that the British Empire was, as you would see from the Member of Parliament who was just shouting down the King in Australia the other day. Everywhere the British Empire was, they left a power imbalance, they left infighting among neighbours, they left infrastructure that was only designed to ship things out of the country back to the mother country, back to Britain. So, like I said, it was a system of extraction and it left people in disarray. But in this country, there's such a hubris, there's such an arrogance, there's such a dismissal and a denial of that history that I felt like it would be inappropriate for me to have the word empire, British Empire, after my name indefinitely, while that history has not been acknowledged or rectified.
What's really interesting as well, you were on a podcast with Professor Kahindi Andrews, and he asked you a similar question. And the discussion was like, why? It shows that empire colonialism is still alive and kicking, because why still use that name? Why still use empire? It's nice to be acknowledged, but it could be called something else. So and Professor Andrews said the fact that it's not changed says a lot.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, how would you like empire to be remembered as part of the program here? What would you like to see to make it authentic?
I mean, when I look around the room, I see the legacy of empire, Our story, not just a black story, our story it's not a tragedy. We are here, we are defining Britain, we are engaging in community right now, right here. So I feel like it's important for us to be able to look around our places of work, our places of worship, our neighborhoods, and be able to understand the story that has tied us together is one of empire. At the end of the day, the reason many of us migrated to this country is because of the history of British involvement in the countries we came from. And look, we're able to build something new out of that history. That's why I decided to write this book at this time. While I can still remember enough of my life, I want to be able to link all of the strands from my education, to my upbringing in London, to the different ethnicities and people that I've been able to connect with. I want to link it to the history of the world, to the history of Britain, and use it as a basis for saying, look, moving forward, we can design our society along the principles that this country claims to hold dear in terms of democratic principles, in terms of inclusion, equality, respect. We could actually design that between us. We don't need that to become a top-down instruction from institutions that don't recognize our own humanity in many cases. That's what I want to say.
And just linking up with that, can we talk about labels and identities being imposed on us as, I think, in my opinion, a form of empire? And you talk about this in the book, that the UK was using words like BAME and blending blackness within that, like it doesn't deserve to be talked about or acknowledged on its own.
Yeah.
This, for me, is a colonial tactic for grouping people and divide and rule.
Yeah.
And it's easier to rule over people if you can just group them as one and the same. When, like you said, we're so diverse. So how do we, because we use these identities as well, how do we overcome these imposed identities and also take these on board as people of global majority backgrounds?
I think we just got to keep telling our stories, Nadia. That's why I'm excited for your book. You know, when we talk about the history of how dance developed along the Silk Road trade route throughout all of these Muslim communities, now I'm going to start getting a better understanding of the nuances of the Muslim world. You know, the more I've learned about that region of Asia anyway, the more I've thought about like how, you know, the differences between Persian culture, Arab culture, you know, like it's just fascinating when you're in contact with real people and you get to talk to them about who they really are. So I'll continue to advocate for art, culture and creativity as a space to do all of that, and to invite the young people into the conversation.
100%. And I wanted to talk in the book you spoke about a guy, Will. I'd hate to be Will right now. But if you could expand on that conversation and what you said that you saw for the first time white privilege in action.
Yeah. So, as I've explained, I grew up in St. Raf's. It was a predominantly black area. And then I went to a secondary school that was mainly Asian. So I didn't really have, I obviously, we're in a predominantly white country. I had much experience with white people throughout my life. I had never studied the invention of race as a concept. When I finally got around to that, I came to realize that the racial categories we're put in were dreamt up by a group of elites once upon a time. Back in the day, even, I can't remember which book I read this in. Actually, I remember, it's called World Making After Empire by a Canadian Ethiopian woman called Adon Getachew. She talks about how America, the country, was founded, yeah? And at the founding of America in the late 1700s, they saw themselves not as Americans, they saw themselves as Pennsylvanians, they saw themselves as settlers from Britain. The categories they had for themselves in their head weren't just white men or Europeans, you know? But as we all know, the way America was built was on a whole class of slave labor. Now, to maintain that slave labor while bringing in new populations of people that were not slave, that's when race science really emerged in the American context. And it coincided with new ideas about race in Europe. So now to justify this two-tier system where some people are not even seen as human by the American Constitution, you gotta say, we want immigration into America from Europeans, but even then, when you look into the details of it, they had a tiered system. We don't really want them Eastern Europeans, we want these type of Europeans. And even in those type of Europeans, we don't want them Irish, we want So they had a whole hierarchy developing over the first 200 years of America's existence, which fueled a whole industry, a whole movement across Europe to start defining the world along racial terms. Now, to people that were born, in the early part of the 20th century, a lot of this stuff just doesn't even seem debatable. It's like, well, of course, there are white people, there are black people, there are Asian people, there are East Asian people, and these categories of human come with different capabilities, come with different intelligence levels and stuff. There were industries, there were institutions, there were universities that popularized this thinking to where a lot of the world couldn't see past it. Now, me and Nadia.
There were human zoos.
There were human zoos.
Yeah, can you believe that?
Like in the 50s, So me and Nadia were talking earlier about how, I think me and Portia were talking about this, my friend Portia at the back, about how a lot of the time when you see suffering around the world, it is just acceptable to a lot of us because we have been conditioned to believe that some people kind of either deserve suffering or it's just part of their way of life. In that part of the world, they're always getting bombed. In that part of the world, they're always starving. Isn't it different when their kids starve? Maybe their kids starve different from our kids. That's how this is the legacy of the construction of whiteness. Now, the subtitle of my book is called Me, Music and the War on Blackness, because a lot of it is about my journey through music, helping me come to terms with the construction of blackness. Blackness being constructed in opposition to whiteness. Now, this isn't a process that African people necessarily signed up to. It's not a process that many African people even acknowledge or agree with today. A lot of people will tell you there's no such thing as black people. A lot of people will tell me you shouldn't have included the word black in your book. We don't acknowledge that.
Yeah. You said that in Uganda when you went. It's not an issue there.
Yeah, I don't feel like a black person when I go to Uganda. And that's what a lot of us as Africans want to remain in. We want to just reject this categorization, this racialization. However, the reason I incorporate it into my book and into my world view is because it is done, it's here. These categories not only have been invented, but they have been used to organize the world. They have been used to organize trade relationships. When there was, I can't remember, the Queen's funeral a couple years ago, last year? Was it a couple years? Last year?
No, 2 years ago.
At the Queen's funeral. I don't know if you guys saw the images of African leaders being received, but it was just embarrassing. It was humiliating. They were piled onto a bus. Joe Biden had a limousine or whatever, some fancy car that and it's inconceivable to expect the European world or the Western world to operate in the same way as the African world. The way that organizations like NATO, like the EU, like the International Monetary Fund, these organizations that pretty much dictate how the rest of the world lives, the way they operate is not democratic. It doesn't include the voices of black and brown people, the UN Security Council, right? But to us, this is normal because what do Africans know about world governance? What do brown people know about geopolitics and macroeconomics? So when we talk about the construction of whiteness, it's not to say that all white people believe themselves to be superior. It's not to say that all white people are racist. It's to say that these categories that were imposed on the human race by a small contingent of predominantly Western Europeans they continue to have material consequences, and until we study them, we're going to be talking about imaginary problems with imaginary solutions.
Yeah. And moving on from that, there's a quote from your book where you say, the economic exploitation, deprivation, inequalities across all levels faced by communities are the result of a bigger picture and the ongoing exploitation of Africa and the rest of the world. The two are inextricably linked. And I think that we see that in certain rafts, we see that, all over. And people talk about our communities being more deprived, but this has a historical, history to it, and then Keir Starmer just said recently he wouldn't acknowledge slavery and reparations, and that we need to not look in the past. We need to look at the future and stuff like climate change, yes, which is important, but even climate inequality is rooted in the past.
Exactly.
So my question is that if those in power really wanted to address it, they would. And then what we do have, though, is the DEI industry, diversity, equality and inclusion, to give the perception that things are being addressed with representation. So what do you think about representation, and do you see it as a colonial tactic?
So a lot of the time when we talk about representation, we're talking about the visible parts of some of these problems. We'll say we need to see more black people in parliament, and then you see Kemi Badala. You know what I mean? We need to see more brown people on the news, and then they're voices that are specifically selected from the elite institutions of this country, who will not come out with a radical world analysis on TV. They will play the game, right? So I'm very suspicious of the DEI industry, of the of representation politics, because a lot of the time it's just tokenism. All skin folk ain't kin folk. It's that simple.
And I wanted to talk about media and mainstream representation of politicians and how they feel hate, and hate between global majority backgrounds as well. And obviously the media propaganda doesn't show the extent of what the Western world has done and is doing across the world. And they don't take responsibility then for those divisions that have then led to things like recently the far-right riots. I think we all saw that coming. What is your take on that and what happened?
At the time of the riots, I posted a poem in which I explained a lot of what you're describing. The rhetoric started at the top, at the level of politicians, media pundits, public so-called intellectuals, who would normalize the most racist talking points. Disrespecting Muslims, black people. The Windrush scandal was like racism institutionalized. Like a decade plus of seeing this from the so-called respectable elites of this country. Now, I'm not gonna excuse the people on the street who are looting, burning and beating up minorities or global majority people. But I do think many of them had the justified belief that they would be backed by the government, that they wouldn't really face consequences because they're only enacting what, and this is why tokenism, you've got to be careful, because Suella Braverman is of the same politics of the people that were in the streets. She's a brown woman. You know what I mean? Priti Patel. These people, I don't even think, Rishi Sunak wasn't in office at the time, was he? But I can't think of one brown politician or black politician who had a mainstream slot where they just denounced this as straight, racism that trickles down, because that's the way many of us perceive it. They got their cue from all of these elites in media and politics that said, enemy number one right now is migrants, asylum seekers, Islamists, is that what they call it? And yeah, there's no accountability. There's this plausible deniability. These are thugs. These are people that are just poor, and the reason they're rioting and beating up brown people is because they're poor. No, it's because racism is a British tradition, and until you deal with that, again, you're talking about an imaginary problem.
Yeah. I think what I wanted to ask you next was about the difference that we see, the inequality we see all around us in media and mainstream narratives, and the difference between the stories of white suffering compared to those from the global majority background. So, I mean, it's just so obvious to like most people, but it's not talked about. The way that the media sees the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, for example, compared to what's happening in Gaza, for example, and we see the inequality playing out on our screens, every day. You also equally speak out about Gaza and connect it with the war on blackness. Just as Nelson Mandela said, none of us are free until the Palestinians are free. Benjamin Zephaniah also spoke about Palestinians, and then we were speaking to Rizan outside about Malcolm X is fighting solidarity with the Palestinians. So I wanted to ask you if you can expand on how you see these struggles, as do many of us, as one.
The Palestinian struggle is a struggle against European colonialism. If that is still a controversial talking point, then so be it. But this is the reality. There's a long documented history of countries like America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand being founded on the basis of initially genocide and ethnic cleansing of the natives. The earliest advocates of Zionism, of Jewish Zionism, used the word colonial in their ambitions. This is not, going back to the construction of whiteness and how these things are intended to be normalized. This is not up for debate. The difference is that once upon a time it wasn't controversial to say this. The British Empire exhibition was 100 years ago. They were proudly demonstrating they had colonial properties. They were saying, come and look at all of our colonies. At a time where, Britain controlled about a quarter of the world's landmass. This is why there was this exhibition. So to say that we are going to need to colonize the land of Palestine was not controversial, but times changed. So now there needs to be this pretense that this has nothing to do with colonialism. Sometimes 100,000 people die in 12 months just because, that's a natural occurrence. Maybe they're bombing themselves. Those of us who have had the opportunity to engage with colonial history, or those of us who are from colonial histories, those of us who have had families that saw their lands torn apart and were unable to go home for various reasons out of their control. It's not beyond our understanding. It's not inconceivable that sometimes very powerful countries decide that they want a piece of land or they don't want to deal with the inconvenience of a native population. Hitler directly talked about his inspiration from the American project. He said, I like what them Americans did with that land over there. I've got something like that in mind, right? So when we talk about the double standard, around how the media has responded to the invasion of Ukraine versus the invasion of Gaza, the continued invasion and occupation of Palestine, it's not rocket science. We're not talking in hieroglyphics. This is very straightforward. Where did the Palestinian people come from? How is it that people that didn't come from anywhere else in the world, except for the region on which they are being bombed, are not being defended? How can their efforts to resist the violence that is being meted out to them by the most powerful countries in the world, how is their effort to resist deemed terrorism? It makes zero sense. They're talking backwards. in order to try and confuse and create a smokescreen around the situation. But yeah, as a generation, I think we've drawn a line in the sand. We're not going for it. I will continue to speak up about this. I do not care who is uncomfortable or angry with me about it. If you're the kind of person to be more offended at someone calling out a genocide than you are about all of the amputees, all of the orphan children, all of the disembodied human beings in Palestine, then you're not really my kind of person. And I don't really
I wanted to ask you about belonging, and because this is an issue that I know that I felt, where you're from the diaspora. Where do you belong? Do we belong here? This is our home, but then you get all this rhetoric that go back to where you came from, that you're not welcome here, all the narratives. Then when we go back to where we're from, it could be lots of different countries for some people. That doesn't fit either. But you speak about this in your book, that you had that mixed feelings of being here and where do you fit in, and then you went to Uganda, I think before you went to Cambridge, and you said that it saved your life, and you suddenly felt comfortable, and I get that, because in certain spaces, in certain countries even, that even aren't maybe my own, but I don't feel othered, you can relax a bit. So I wonder if you could talk through that experience, and how important is it to feel like you belong?
Yeah, I think a lot of us can relate to this thing of never really being fully from one area. This is a largely immigrant community, so I'm sure many of you come from places in the world where you no longer identify with the majority experience, but you still feel some connection. Again, me and my friend were talking about this earlier today. And to be honest, there's no easy answer to this. I was fortunate in that when I went back to Uganda on my own at the age of 19, Uganda just felt like a perfect fit to me. I'd been so stressed by the condition of like my demographic out here, and there was so much tension in our social world that to go to a context where that tension didn't exist, it was a breath of fresh air. But then the more time I spend in Uganda, the more I realized that it's not a picnic for the majority of Ugandans, I would say, and I have a lot of unlearning to do to be able to survive in that environment, not just on a holiday basis, but to be able to understand the politics and the mentality and the direction of the country. So there's not one thing, but what I do realize also when I go over to Uganda is that I benefit from being able to move back and forth, from being able to dialogue with people from different walks of life. A lot of my friends in Uganda believe that the solution to their problem will be able to just come over to London. I'm like, boy, I don't think you know London like that, right? But I have the privilege, I recognize I have the privilege of going and getting a spiritual top-up. Like when I'm there, like even if I'm not able to completely live independently and understand everything that's going on, at least I get a different perspective, which is what I experienced when I was 19. So I do, at the end of the day, see the value in that exchange. That's why I believe we're lucky to live in a part of the world where there's this much range. But I just wish more people had that option. I hate the inequality in our passports. I hate the fact that some people are just doomed to never ever be able to explore options outside of where they live. I hate that. It's not fair. Capital, money can move around the world so much easier than human beings. And the nasty rhetoric that we hear from our politicians makes progression on that so much harder. So yeah, we need to rethink that.
you don't even realise the amount of trauma that you're carrying. Like, it's like you're always in fighting mode. Where's the next attack going to come from, whether it be a microaggression or an obvious one? And then when you do take time out and go to countries or places that welcome you, they're happy to have you there. You just feel like this weight is off your shoulders, and it's really sad that that happens, that you're made to feel like that in what is your home. Belonging, for me, like feeling like I belong here, came with reading up on my own history. And when I say my own history, like global history, because we're taught history in silos, like it doesn't connect.
Yeah.
Like we have Black History Month, like it's separate to every other history. It's all one and the same. When I studied at school and we learned about Elizabeth I, the Queen of England, Henry VIII's daughter, we didn't learn about her connection to the rest of the world. Like, she was rejected by the Pope. She was discommunicated. She had no allies. She went to the Ottoman Empire and the Moroccan kingdoms to forge friendships. That was a key part of her reign. And because of that, you had different ambassadors coming here, people traveling, you had carpets, you had coffee came by the Ottoman world. It came from Ethiopia to Yemen to the rest of the world. We didn't study this. Shakespeare and other plays around that time referred to the rest of the world, the Muslim world. I studied Shakespeare for A-level English. Didn't really see that connection apart from Othello, but it wasn't really talked about enough. So when I felt like I belonged is when I studied myself, and I didn't feel alien here because I knew what our ancestors, our people, our countries built here. Our people built these lands also. So we have a stake here, and that made me feel, I'm not going to hide, because you used to hide your identity. Well, you can't really hide it, but you just want to keep quiet, keep your head down. So I don't know if you felt that.
Yeah, there was just a gap. There was just a blank space where I didn't understand how all of this stuff connected. But it's always great to really get an education on this stuff, because that's the only way you can fill those gaps. Otherwise, you're kind of playing guesswork, or you're just burying your head in the sand, like you mentioned.
Thank you so much, George. We're going to open up the floor to questions in a moment, but before we do that, I was wondering if you would do a performance for us.
This one's called Every October. Every October I got people hitting me up, trying to book a man for Black History Month. And every time they tell me they got limited funds, I feel to give this response. First of all, Black history is too big for a month. Secondly, I'm not about to be the ignorant one, getting hired to spit some nice lyrics for 5 minutes about progress, so we consider it done. When you learn about the real Black history, trust me, you will act different. Can't help but feel that physically. The birthplace of everything. Don't let them gas you like Egypt was a separate thing. Or them sphinxes and pyramids and dynasties. Enough Black kings and queens, it's in the genes. So why they giving me a history that's incomplete? Maybe we're easy to contain when we think we're weak. Or in the street, not getting a wink of sleep. Maybe rather that than have us thinking deep. Maybe they know Africans influenced the Greeks when European society was in its infancy. But it's deeper than that. Let's keep it a stack. There's human beings on five continents, but at first we could only survive one of them. So let's stop getting it twisted. Without Africa, humanity would have never existed. See, back when England was bush, there was ivory, iron, and gold flowing in the kingdom of Kush. Like most African empires, they harbored treasure, military strength, and advanced architecture. Growing up, the Rasta man was our professor. He used to break it down like a Harvard lecture. If it weren't for him, we wouldn't even know these things. Rasta used to tell us about the Ethiopians. They were early with the symbols and sculptures. Europeans used to come and learn from these important cultures. I don't know how they act like Africa weren't a factor with all those artifacts they haven't returned from capture. Nah, man. We had geometry from Kwade. How long? Archaeology can't say. The Ghana Empire made its own pathway. So don't let the story get told halfway. Through trade, they established a stable economy, and taxes got paid to the monarchy. I never knew nothing. I used to hardly inquire, but I still heard about the Mali Empire. Just like Ghana before them, they made so much money it was hard to ignore them. Mansa Musa's still the richest man that ever lived. I wonder why there's no movie about him. Probably because Hollywood want to focus on the negative. Even though the truth would benefit hella kids and that slavery message is getting repetitive. But I don't blame you if you never heard of these legendary things though. These guys ain't giving man the necessary info. And it weren't just kings, yo. North African queens backed down opponents. And I'm not just talking about background involvement. Queen Amanarenas led 30,000 soldiers on the front line and they smacked down the Romans. Nzingambande, down in Angola, told the Portuguese, you ain't allowed to control us. Best believe she held it down when they rolled up. And she weren't the only one. Same thing the female warriors of the homie done. They fought for freedom, hoping progress would slowly come, knowing this road is a lonely one. Which brings me to today. Remembering the queens and kings leading the way reminds me there's certain things we need to say, sacrifices to make. When it comes to this, I have no time for mistakes, no appetite for debate. I have to write something great. It's black and white in a way. You know my message is amplified by my fame, my brand, my pride and my name. I stand behind what I say. Why? Because I'm a son of the kingdom of Uganda. Cornerstone of what you now think of as Uganda. Our thing was in place for half a millennium. You can't tell me the past was as dark as my melanin. My ancestors had structure, scientific and spiritual answers for everything. Now every October I got people hitting me up, trying to book a man for Black History Month. And every time they tell me they got limited funds, I feel to give this response. You know Black History is too big for a month. Secondly, I'm not about to be the ignorant one, getting hired to spit some nice lyrics for 5 minutes about progress so we consider it done. Nah. Let's start from the beginning for once. Let's talk about what Africa has given to us. Because everything I'm telling you is documented. So ask yourself, why is it hidden from us? When you learn about the real Black history, trust me, you will act differently. Can't help but feel that physically. The birthplace of everything. When the truth comes knocking, you better let it in. Thank you very much.
I love that. Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to open up the floor to questions. We've got a question over there.
Thank you very much, George and Nadia. It's been really educational, interesting, inspiring, everything. I wanted to find out a little bit about your time in Cambridge. You mentioned that you went at 19 to Uganda. I'm just wondering how that kind of helped you when you were in Cambridge, and maybe how maybe it made it more difficult because you had been in Uganda amongst your people, and then you went to Cambridge, and it was quite different, I imagine.
Thank you for your question. When I got to Cambridge, I think I write about this in the book, for about 4 months, I dreamt about Uganda every single night. I've never experienced anything like that before. I'm not an overly sentimental guy, especially at 19. But there's no other way to put it. I was in love. I was in love, like I'd fallen in love. I couldn't stop thinking about being in Uganda. And there was not one thing. I don't know what it was. It's not one person or one circle or one group of people or one activity. It was just everything. I would wake up and realize I wasn't there. I was actually in the university that I used to dream of going to. But my spirit experienced something that couldn't be supplemented. It couldn't be replaced or substituted. And at the same time, in Cambridge, I was quite lonely. So I threw myself into the social life in the first 3 months. But yeah, like everyone was just so different from what I was used to. It led to me just staying in my room a lot. But the plus side of that is that really fueled my poetry.
Thank you for your question. We've got a question at the back there.
Firstly, I would like to say you are a very big inspiration. I used to listen to your podcast all the time, traveling into and from work. I worked in Heathrow at the time, so I just put my headphones on the train and I've listened to you. My main question is, what advice would you give to anybody from the younger generation that's trying to break into the entertainment industry, kind of, especially somebody that's battled between their environment and kind of all the industry vultures that's out there?
Yeah.
How would you best navigate through that for a beginner?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for listening to my podcast, man. So the podcast is a good example of the advice I would give you. The bottom line is you have to make yourself different. The good news is you're born different. What tends to happen to a lot of us, especially young black men, is that we start to hide our difference because it becomes a survival thing. To fit in, you don't want to be noticed, you don't want to be separated from the group. So when people try and make it as artists, they really disadvantage themselves because they try and act and sound and look like everyone else. Makes it very difficult. That benefits the labels because they are able to create like a machine. This is the template that we're pushing out. And the template for a black man, of course, you have to be dangerous, you have to get all the girls, you have to have money. And what that does is it drives us to damn near kill ourselves because we're trying to fit a type that has been imposed on us, not for the benefit of our spirits or our communities. So the first thing is appreciate your difference. Embrace your difference. In my case, I was different in that I wasn't a gangster. I wasn't, even though I could rap, I wasn't trying to make it as a gangster rapper. I was exactly what you see now. I was just a young man with questions and passion for my community. So that became my difference. That's why I made it as a poet, because I took the skills from rap and I was able to talk to a very real situation. With the podcast, for those of you who don't know, my podcast is like roughly 30-minute episodes where I talk about all aspects of life. But the secret ingredient that has made the podcast successful, I think, is that I am obsessed with the lived experiences of people around me. So the podcast isn't all about my life. It's not about, my marriage and my family, and it's just about my community. It's about my, what I observe around me. So I used those talking points, which I don't always see in the media, to create something different. So you really want to separate yourself, use your points of difference to your advantage, and just work like crazy. That's the other thing. Yeah.
Thanks, Arabs. Question from Kwaki.
Right, thank you very much. Obviously, I think everybody appreciates George being here, fantastic. But actually, I want to hail Nadia, because Nadia works for the council. and she had to do some delicate things, I would say, political or whatever. So I think you did a good job in pushing the narrative and the conversation forward, irrespective of the fact that you work for the council. Talking about Gaza, the Palestine stuff, that needed to be said. So I'm glad that you had the opportunity to say it without fear. Now, George, I know you said you left your label. You're signed to Ireland, right? Yeah. Some years ago, there was a guy called John Cooper Clarke, who was a poet. And it was like a big thing. It was done by EMI. So the next thing was going to be poets. I was just surprised why you're signed to Ireland, because such in the music business, and you came as a poet. So who signed you? And then why did you leave, considering that they knew what you were doing? For example, Ireland signed a guy called Silent Eclipse, and I'm reading Darkness's biography. And he was one of the guys that didn't quite make it, because he was a rapper that was really cutting it hardcore. So I'm just wondering why the relationship, considering they saw something you had to post a singer, and then it didn't work out. So can you just say a little bit about that for me? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. So I touch on this a lot in the book, and one of the main conclusions that I reached is that my kind of material, the John Cooper Clarke kind of strain of poetry, is not embraced by the music industry. When it can be capitalized on, it will. But in order to normalize it and continue to push this to the radio, the people that work in the music industry, the whole culture would have to change. Because the music industry does things according to what the radio wants and according to what mainstream TV wants. That's their model of success. Now in the book, I explain how I tried to present new models. I tried to say, instead of us aiming for the radio, let us try and target public services, because they're all embedded within the community. And if we create material for public services, like mother and baby units, like libraries, we could go straight to tens of thousands of people across the country. For whatever reason, they weren't interested in that model. What I was suggesting was too different. It was too much of a deviation away from the way they usually do things. I believe that there are political reasons behind this. When you study the field of mass communication developed as a discipline after World War II as a tactic, as a Cold War tactic. How do we capture young minds? How do we combat the influence or the appeal of communism coming from the Soviet Union, blah, 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 blah. So when we look at the way these media have been developed, it is not a neutral space. I really take quite a lot of words in the book to try and explain this. So I'm no longer, at the time when I left Ireland, I thought it's just a failure of this team and my own failure to, put it all together. But there's so much talent in our communities. There are so many talented rappers in this country, talented poets in this country, that it cannot be a coincidence that none of their voices are mainstream. And it cannot be a coincidence that all the mainstream black male voices in this country tend to be street adjacent, tend to be promoting the same image of black masculinity that has been promoted for the past however many decades. I no longer think that's a coincidence. I accept that that's the nature of the mainstream industry that I was initially operating in. And I'm just now trying to do what people like John Cooper Clarke did and create a new space where different kinds of voices can thrive.
Thank you. I spent 1 hour reading your book in the Ealing Library.
We've got a question here at the front.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for your event today, both of you. Just one quick question. If we want to know more about our history and we're confused, how do I deprogram myself? Can you recommend one book that you would say go and borrow from Wilson Library and start reading?
I hope Wilson Library has this book. There's a book called Uncommon Wealth.
Uncommon Wealth?
Yeah, like the Commonwealth, but Uncommon Wealth. It's by a guy called Kojo Koran. He's a very good thinker. He's based in Birkbeck Uni. There's Uncommon Wealth, The New Age of Empire by Kehinde Andrews, Kehinde Andrews, and his podcast, which is called Make It Plain, in Malcolm's words.
Thank you.
No worries, thank you.
Hi, hello. I follow you on your socials and I applaud you for being unapologetically you and speaking your truth. So well done, especially being a black man. A lot of black men's voices aren't heard. So being a spoken word artist, how did you you talked about how mainstream record labels kind of didn't see your vision. How did you get your vision out there then? And then second question, where did you buy your book from? Oh, is it outside? Oh, okay, cool. Sorry, I came in a bit late, that's why.
No worries, the book's available for sale just outside. Thank you for asking. And yeah, as I advised the brother earlier, I think I was able to present something that was different and it was appealing enough. So I wouldn't just say being political and being different is enough. Like I was an artist. I've been an artist since I was young, and I've been working pretty much every day of my life on my art in some way for 15 years now. The only thing is I applied it differently. I came up with people like Harold creatives. We were all trying to make it work at one point, but many people took the same skills that I was developing and they used it in ways that didn't lead to success. I think because my work was intended to be educational, I established like an appeal beyond just entertainment. So if all else fails, I could just focus on schools, I could focus on prisons, I could focus on public service, as I was saying. And now I'm doing a PhD, which largely comes from the argument that our music can do way more than just make money. It can be a public service. So yeah, if you try and apply your talent to some kind of service that other people can benefit from, regardless of what the music industry says, because they have a certain ethos and a certain politic, you will always find connection with community.
Thank you for your question. We've got a question here from Diane. Hi George, so it's amazing to watch your journey. You won't remember me. I knew you, I think, you might have been about 14 or 15, All Souls. I was one of the youth leaders at St Mary's, so we used to get together, the churches, have activities and joint services. And I remember you shared your testimony as a young man. And I also interviewed you in 2020 for the Borough Culture. Yeah. Okay, so I'm also a reggae ambassador, and this young man, Harold, I'm also very proud of the work that you do too. So, in terms of the music, so my late mother used to tell me to listen to the words of music, not just Bob Marley, so my roots come from Jamaica. Yeah, and music teaches you. There are certain songs that I wouldn't dance to because of the lyrics. So I've been inspired by music. I lost both my parents in 2018, and my husband as well. Music has inspired me, it's healed me, it's done so much for me. So I'm going to ask you, I'm a reggae ambassador, so I'm going to ask you, what is one of the reggae, a song that has inspired you? And I'll also ask you for a song of another genre of your choice that has inspired you in terms of lyrics.
Okay, in terms of lyrics, the first one that comes to mind is Burning Spear. Christopher Columbus. Yes, Christopher Columbus. So in a lot of my poetry, I try and explain how growing up in this environment around a lot of Jamaicans, especially around Rasta influence, that was my introduction to black consciousness. And a song like Christopher Columbus, that's, to hear the dismissal of their narrative, just powerful, and I love Jamaica. Like apart from Uganda, Jamaica's the one place where I believe that I could live the rest of my life, because these kind of conversations, that come from an Afro-conscious place, they're just normal when I go to Jamaica. so many people understand all of the stuff that we talked about today. So there's that. And another song, it's also a reggae song, Bob Marley, Zimbabwe. I didn't know about, my dad introduced us to that song. We used to listen to it with my little brother. And I didn't know about the Zimbabwe liberation struggle and how Bob went over and performed at that time when they got their independence. But the older I get and the more I can put these things into context, it just makes me emotional listening to it, man.
Thank you. Thanks, Diane. I think there was a question here.
I think I should stand up, sorry. Hi George, my name's Zahra and Nadia. Thank you so much for being here. I'm also an avid listener of your podcast and I've been following a lot of your works as well, and I'm definitely going to grab the book because you said it's outside. I did sort of have to type this up because it is a bit of a loaded question. So with it obviously being Black History Month, I know that you correctly noted that it's obviously been restricted to just a month, and obviously it's so much more than that. Do you feel that it needs to be diversified more to reflect the nuances within Black and African cultures and those that belong to other ethnic minority backgrounds? I say that because I share in your experience because I'm also East African, I'm from Somalia, and oftentimes I feel like the treatment of Black History Month is very prescriptive. It's sort of like they cherry pick what we're going to see just for that month. So, and I know that you mentioned, Nadia, about BAME and how, where sort of Black people are treated like a monolith. And obviously we're much more than that. There's so much enriching cultures within, as you can see in Brent and in this room. What do you think that we should do, sort of, if you can try and narrow it down, what would you propose that we do to sort of, I guess, educate ourselves, like each other, so that we can, I guess, educate everyone else, to sort of dismantle this perception that Blackness looks one way, everyone has one sort of experience. That was a bit loaded, but anyway.
It's an important question, thank you. The first thing I'll say is quite practical. Where possible, talk to your grandparents. Download their stories, because once they move on and transition, that's a significant chunk of our history that we can't get back. So on the most informal level, talk to your grandparents where it's still possible, and your parents. Secondly, this is now on the more extreme end. You've got to help me and help the rest of the community build a syllabus. From whatever corner of the world that you are from or that you are curious about, we are still at that stage that Nadia and I talked about where, it falls on us. If we spend the next 10 years trying to campaign, let's say the Labour government, to include all the nuances of Somali history, which I've only started digging into in my life in the past couple of years, how likely is it that will lead to an institutional change versus within the Somali community for there to be a movement to start pulling together a syllabus or different syllabi about the experience. So I've dreamed about this for years, like if every part of our little community in Brent came up with their syllabus of their history and we had a collective sharing. It could be every October, it could be every other month, it could be every month. But at the level that we're at right now, we're still going for each one teach one. So we have to work with that model, I think.
Yeah. And I would say as well, tell your story, because I sort of took that on myself as well, where I saw gaps, and we got social media now, we've got platforms, use it, and don't wait for anybody else. Do it and you build momentum, I think.
And you'd be surprised, you'll find an audience eventually that comes looking. When I started my podcast, we didn't have a ready-made audience. People kind of knew my name, but it wasn't getting many listens per month. But as people are able to come on board, you can find a backlog of work about who I am, who we are, and just different ideas of how to present our story.
100%. Savannah, you got a question? Go
I've
ahead.
got a quick question for George, sorry. Hello?
How did you get into poetry?
Well, what should I? beautiful name. I got into poetry, Savannah, because I love music. And every time I listened to music, it made me want to write something. So if you like music, just know that poetry is also part of it. You write your experience, you write your perspective, and that becomes poetry. You gonna try it out? Promise? Alright. Thanks so much, Savannah.
Is there another one?
Yeah, there's another question.
Oh. Oh, good job.
What were you doing when you were 8 years old?
When I was 8 years old, I was in the library. Alright, I was watching cartoons. What else was I doing? I used to draw. Before I did any poetry, I used to draw all the time. So if you have any hobbies like that, keep it up, because you never know what it will lead to. Alright? Just as I said that.
Thank you for your wonderful questions. I think we had a question here.
How you doing, George? Long time no see, as well. Good, man. You just got a little bit of a story as well. He used to draw, but he used to be a dope dancer as well. We used to dance together when we was like 12 years old. Yeah, I just want to say, first and foremost, truly inspirational. It's nice to see my brother doing well. You know what I mean? From growing up, Shaolin days to the rapping to everything that you're doing now is absolutely inspirational. And you're setting an amazing example, not just for me, not just for across all the generations. So everybody, just want to give you another round of applause for that. I just want to know what's next. Like, how can we support you in whatever the next endeavor is, what the next venture is? As they say, one of the biggest threats was the rise of a male black leader. I read that in the, I think it was the Women's Chronicles. They said the CIA, one of the biggest threats was a male black leader. And that's exactly the kind of role that you're stepping into. Whether you want to do it or not, you're kind of leading the way in that way. But what's the next thing for you? And what's the next project and how do we support it?
Thank you for asking, bro. Well, the priority, I think, is education. Because that will form a long-term basis for all the change, all the structural change I've talked about. There's no point saying there's a different way to run our economy, there's a different way to run our society, if the majority of people have not had a chance to have a real debate over years. You know, it's not going to happen over one Black History Month. You know, so my approach to putting in place that education is now taking, this is why I wrote this book at this time, take all my little experiments, everything that I've proven that can be done with art, everything that I've learned, that you lot in the community have taught me, can be done with our stories and our experiences and our cultural expressions. Yeah, me and Harold used to dance in Brent Summer University. Again, the cultural spaces that we've learned from. Yeah, take that and now do what I was just saying with Sahara. Like, start developing a syllabus. So I'm developing my little syllabus, and I'm going to start making it available via YouTube. That will be in the coming months, probably in the new year. And yeah, I guess to answer your question, when I make that live, by all means engage and get in touch if you think there's anything that I might be missing or anything that you could help with. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your question. We're running out of time, so we can take probably one more question, if there is one.
Yes, sorry, those books that you mentioned earlier, the 2 books, can you give me those again in the authors, please?
Yeah.
And what they're all about?
The first one is called Uncommon Wealth by an author called Kojo, Kojo, Koram, Koram. And that is about the end of the British Empire becoming the Commonwealth and how that created the world that we live in today, long story short. Each chapter focuses on a different aspect. One of it is the debt that a lot of these new Commonwealth countries were drowned in. One of it is the tax systems that developed, all sorts, yeah. But it's really easily written. I love that book. And it's up to date. It was like from 2021. Another book that I would say is The New Age of Empire by a brother called Kahinde Andrews, Kehinde Andrews. And that book is very like similar in terms of subject matter, but it just explains how the colonial era never really ended. It just adapted to a new world. And again, it's written very straightforward. I love that book.
Okay, we've got one final question here.
George, two questions. First one, my favourite book is The Invisible Man, Grant Elson. Anytime you feel invisible, you have to fight your way to get where you are. And second question, growing up in Sir Raphael and Marsden, how grounded that kept you basically? It must have kept you quite grounded to know the background.
Yeah. I mean, the answer to both of those questions is kind of linked. I did feel kind of invisible in the early part of my life. We didn't have roots in this country. My parents came, and to their credit, you know, they weren't like connected out here. You know, we had to start from scratch, and it was made very clear that the strategy is education. So I embraced that path, and I was patient, even though I didn't feel like we had a voice as a community on the mainstream level. I believed that I was working my way to eventually getting it through my educational career. But then the community taught me how to rap, and then back to being from Harsden, St. Raf's. I start picking up the cultural practice, like I was saying about the influence of Rastafari, the influence of African consciousness in Harsden mainly. All of these things helped me start developing a way to engage with the world outside of formal education. Because remember, I'm in a very middle-class white institution. So I'm basically getting the best of both worlds in terms of the input into what is now going to become the voice that I address the world with.
You're being fed basically.
Exactly. And I think I was fortunate in recognizing the value. My mum used to get stressed, because I used to hang around the barber shop just to try and make any money that I could, do whatever. I would sweep up, go get people's food, clean the equipment, whatever. But then I would try and study for my GCSEs in Harsden Library, which is like right next to the barber shop. But it's like...
I was doing it all the time, so I used to see you in there.
Oh, you saw me in there?
Yeah, I was doing it all the time.
Right.
I'm a bookworm, so...
There you go. But that is a perfect snapshot of how my mind was in two places the whole time. I didn't want to fail my GCSEs, but I didn't want to not be in the community, because I understood the educational value of both. So thank you for that question.
Well, they keep saying next month, so keep an eye out on my channel.
Because you know I'm at the Queen's Spot Book Festival, so as soon as it comes out, I'll try and get you a slot there.
Oh, thank you. Heard it here. Heard it here first. Thank you.
Sorry, just want to say something about this library.
This is my mom.
Georgie's dad here as well. So this library, as Georgie says, I remember my earliest memory of bringing him was quite literally in his pram, in his pushchair, and I pushed it all the way down Gladstone Park because money was so tight, but you had to walk to get to the library. And yes, those two little girls that were there the whole time, I am just so impressed. That is the way to go. Yes. Bring them to events like this. Yeah. Bring them to the libraries. I mean, I didn't know. Me and George's dad, now wildest dreams, we didn't know what it was. We just knew that, hey, the children need books, the children need knowledge. We are not rich. We can't go to whatever. But we brought them to the library. When George rang me to invite me to this event, he and I were slightly emotional. We said, yeah, remember that library was very, very much a part of your growing up and our experience. And I just want to give a shout for this library and just say that, yeah, we're very, very grateful.
George and I were talking before, weren't we, about bring the kids, this is how we grew up, in the environment of education, learning, activism. And even if you don't understand all of it, you'll soak it in. I bought my nephew today. So I think that's really important. So I'm really sorry we've run out of time for questions, but I wanted to say thank you so much, George. Thank you for being such an inspiration and being so humble. This whole experience has just been just amazing to work with you. I want to say, please remember, everybody, what George has been saying about we need to embrace our difference. We need to embrace our own identity. You don't have to take imposed labels. You know, be who you want to be, and keep learning. We keep learning from the cradle to the grave. We're still learning, aren't we, George? You know, it's been a journey, and we will continue to do so. And we should really impart to our younger people the importance of learning, thinking outside of the box, and not taking everything at face value. I wanted to say, God bless you, George, and your parents. You know, it's always the parents really that we should really applaud. And may you continue in your good works and to speak your truth. And thank you so much once again. Big round of applause for George. Thank you.